Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who has joined for the first time on this topic or from last week, where we had some audio issues. Some people couldn't join, so Debbie made herself available to rerun this webinar live, and we will have a live QA at the end. But before that, very, very briefly, just in case you're not familiar with TraceGains provides an automated supplier quality, compliance, and regulatory document management solution for food and beverage manufacturers, ingredient manufacturers, processors, and suppliers. TraceGains negates the manual data entry and maintenance of spreadsheets by automatically turning documents into actionable data so that compliance with your business rules is monitored 24/7. Supplier scorecards are updated every night, and you are 365 audit ready. And today's webinar is creating an approved supplier program as a prerequisite for a successful HACCP program. As I just mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end. Please type in your questions in the chat dialog box that is on your screen. We will get them addressed after both Debbie and Gary have presented, and we'll let the Q&A run for as long as is necessary. Today's presenters are Debby Newslow, President of DL Newslow and Associates, and Gary Nowacki, CEO of TraceGains. Go ahead, Debbie.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. You always leave this slide for me, Mark, and I guess if you want to learn more about me, I've been doing this for seems like about 300 or 400 years, and my latest accomplishment that I'm proud of is my new book on food safety management programs. So you're welcome to visit my website if you want more information on this or more information on what we do. I won't bore you with our background, but have been doing this for many years and have been blessed with seeing many, many systems, whether food, chemical, corrugated, all through the realm of different industry sectors. And my experience started out with 9001 and has carried over into the food safety management systems based on my background in food science and quality control in the food industry. So to get started on the bulk of what you really came to hear about, let me move forward. I need three hands because I'm trying to do slides and hold the phone. But anyways. So welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you either joined for the first time or for those that joined us last week and had technical issues. I welcome you back. So let's get started. What role does your supplier play in your HACCP program? You've heard numerous times, we can't control the supplier. What do we need to do? Why do we even need to bother with them if we don't have control? They've been in business for a long time. They wouldn't be selling their products if they didn't know what they were doing. So we trust them. We just do. We can't risk asking too much and then losing them, or can we? Can we really come down on the supplier and say, you must do this or we won't use you anymore? We might be shooting ourselves in the foot. So what do we do? Do we just trust them? And we pray that our suppliers take food safety and quality as seriously as we do? Remember, we are responsible for our products, and that includes supplies that we use to make our products. We can never be any better than what we start with. So we'll take a brief look at HACCP, and then we'll look at your favorite prerequisite programs, one of the favorite ones, supplier management. So things we must remember about our HACCP programs. HACCP is not a standalone program. Production of safe-proof products requires that the HACCP program be built on a solid foundation of prerequisite programs. Prerequisite programs provide the basic environment and operating conditions that are necessary for the production of safe, wholesome food. And that's the thing to remember. What do we do to support our HACCP program? Definition of a prerequisite program is a program in place that when maintained effectively will either eliminate a potential hazard or reduce it to an acceptable limit. Failure to meet prerequisite program requirements increases the likeliness of failure, and thus PRP programs must be effective. And this includes all the prerequisite programs, whether we're talking about pest control, GMP compliance, employee hygiene, Today we happen to be talking about supplier management, and this is critical to the production of safe products. Examples of some, as I just mentioned, pest control, other examples, allergen control, raw material control, sanitation, chemical control, water treatment, traceability and recall, which we're going to talk about later. Again, our topic today is the very important supplier management program. So why should we be concerned about our suppliers? A hazard comes from two places. It's added during your process, or it's created and received from your supplier. Think about some of the recent recalls. We'll look at it in another slide, but think about them. About 60% of recalls can be traced to a supplier. I was told that this was a recent survey that resulted in tracing back to 60% of recalls were caused by suppliers. I don't know. Some people think that's high. I don't know if it's high. It might be actually low. We don't need to think too long about this figure and whether it's low or high when we look at some of the examples. Pet food with the melamine in it. That was from the supplier. Ice cream with wrong ingredients, where a supplier sent peanuts instead of butter pecans. Of course, PCA, Peanut Corporation of America, that's something like, where do we start? But that PCA was actually supplied about 2,500. Their peanut butter went into about 2,500 different type products, from dog food to crackers to cookies to ice cream to just about everything. One of the massive recalls for ingredients that we've ever had. Spinach recall several years ago was E. coli in the water supply. What about the aflatoxin in corn, where, corn, several recalls with pet food for aflatoxin that came from the corn that they got from their supplier. We've had some packaging recalls due to broken glass from the supplier of the glass bottles. And then there's cross-contamination from shipping conditions. What about conditions with the tankers? Are they cleaned properly? Do they have any leaks? There was a recall years ago with where a tanker carried raw eggs and later on carried HFCS and had a recall due to salmonella in the end product. So in shipping conditions, what about the transportation company that we hire to deliver our products? Are the trucks clean? Are they refrigeration on? Are they kept frozen? The temperature storage? Do they have any holes in them? Again, that would be an example of a supplier. So it's really when you stop and think about it, it really can be really intensive. Everything that it reaches. So what do we do to protect the safety of the product? And trust and verify, is that the answer? Well, how do we ensure that our suppliers are not seen as food safety hazards? Can we even do this? Can we even ensure it? Could we do due diligence and manage the due diligence and prove that we're doing the best we can to ensure the suppliers send us supplies and materials that don't have hazards? And if they did, who do we blame? And does blame even matter? If we have a massive recall and people are getting sick from eating our product, do they really care that we say, well, we had the ingredient was tainted and it's not our fault? We must be proactive in today's world. We must go out there and be as proactive as we can, think of all the possible scenarios that could go wrong, and confirm that we're doing whatever we can to control those. We no longer can say this is how we have always done it, nor can we say we're going to learn from our mistakes. And really, making the comment we're doing the best we can, is that really enough? Dr. Deming back in the 50s and 60s said that doing the best we can may not be good enough. Henry Ford said that quality means doing it right when no one is looking. So, really, what are we going to do to really control our suppliers, and how do we do it? That's a $54,000 question, that's for sure. Wherever we can, we need to engineer out the cause, control the hazard before it gets to the plant. So we want to put as much onus and as much responsibility on the supplier as we possibly can. They're responsible for giving us a product that is hazard-free. If we are manufacturing raw hamburger, it doesn't give us the right to be careless with our sanitation, because we know the end user is going to cook it. We are responsible to get them a hazard-free material. Identify food safety critical supplies. This is more than just ingredients. Primary and secondary packaging materials. How do we know what the packaging company is doing in order to ensure that they don't have any hazards in the product? I've done a lot of training classes, a lot of communication with packaging folks where they say, we don't need a hazard analysis. We don't have any CCPs. But you know, it's not about critical control points. It's about the prerequisite programs. How about their cross-contamination? How about their GMPs? About their pest control? And that's where they go back, and that's what they concentrate on, and button those up, or confirm that they're buttoned up and that they have they're in control of their prerequisite programs. What about processing aids such as lubricants, cleaning chemicals, boiler chemicals, and their purpose? How would they manufacture? Are we sure that they are actually not bringing us hazards? Product contact surfaces, equipment, gaskets. These last two, processing aids and product contact surfaces, sometimes they're combined into one, product contact surfaces. But it's anything that could come in contact with the product, whether, such as stainless steel piping, such as gaskets. What about the unloading hose? We have a lot of comments about and discussions about that unloading hose. Do we use the unloading hose that the bulk tanker brings us? And how do we know where that unloading hose has been? How do we know what's been through that? Is that washed and handled the same way the tanker is? What about it if we use our own unloading hose? We have to make sure it's food grade and it's safe and it's made of the right material. If we don't educate our purchasing folks, they might look in a catalog and say, wow, this looks the same as the one we have and it's half the price. Maybe we should get that. So we need to educate and train people to understand why we're using the materials and the items that we are. And then what about the service suppliers? We can't forget the service suppliers. So many times when we go into a facility, they may have their ingredients and their packaging all identified and under control, but what about the service suppliers? What are the service suppliers? What are some examples? They may include contractors. How about cleaning and sanitation? Do you outsource that and you have people coming in? Janitorial. Did an audit one time where a plant had all kinds of great things defined and implemented, but the person that was hired to do the janitorial was never educated in what the cleaning chemicals were supposed to be, and they had unapproved chemicals in a closet right in the middle of the processing area. How about pest control? They're providing you a service. They have to meet your requirements that relates to quality and food safety. Laboratory testing, calibration, transportation, waste removal, temporary services. These are just a few examples, and even if you're owned by a corporate office, some of these may be dictated by the corporate office, but what are you doing to ensure that when they're in your facility, they're doing what they're supposed to and not bringing in hazards or adding hazards to the process? What do we hear a lot of times, when we do these audits from these facilities? Things like, well, we don't allow glass in our plant. Where did that glass bottle of soda come from? We have an approved chemical list. Where did that bottle of glass cleaner come from? We only order food-grade lubricants. Where did that non-food grade lubricant come from, and how did it get here? We don't allow allergens in the facility. Our associates are trained. They know better. Where did this come from? What do you think the answers to these questions are? Probably the outside contractors or sources of services. They're not trained and educated. They're on their own, and they can bring things in, maybe not on purpose, but they bring them in not knowing any better. So how should a supplier be chosen and approved? Choose suppliers that meet your company needs, both related to product and service requirements. Know your ingredient requirements and your product requirements, including any known food safety hazards and how these are normally controlled. If you're a dairy and you're processing fluid milk, you know that raw milk has a very high likelihood and a high significant outcome for pathogen. And if you don't pasteurize that product, likely you could get someone very, very sick. So understanding that in the raw milk as an ingredient, the organization has controls in place to ensure that the pathogens are controlled and killed. So that's the same thing with, you can put the onus on the facility, but at times there are things that you just have to do in your facility whether it's 100% inspection or some sort of inspection when you receive the product in, that you need to look at to make sure that it's that you double check what you're hoping and expecting the supplier to accomplish. The type and extent of control applied to a supplier is dependent on the effect of the purchased product on product safety, product parameters, and customer specifications. So, you understand the item. If an item is a dry product such as sodium benzoate, it's not really a high-risk ingredient because of the nature of the process. It could now become cross-contaminated in transportation, so you inspect that on receipt. But it's not but if you're getting something in like raw hamburger or meats or something like that, that would be considered, or raw eggs, that would be considered a high-risk item. Now, let's think about that. Earlier I talked about engineering the problem out. Raw eggs is a known high-risk item. Pasteurized eggs come with a lot less risk because they're already pasteurized. Yes, they have risks, and yes, you have to deal with pasteurized eggs to help prevent some hazards, but it's not at the level of a raw egg. So that's where engineering some of the issues out or helping your situation. Based on knowledge of the operations and its product, define the criteria for selection, evaluation, and monitoring that would ensure continued compliance with the organization's defined requirements. And as always, maintain records that confirm compliance and effectiveness. Remember, if you don't have a record, then you did not do it. Those of you that know me and have attended any of our workshops or ever heard me speak, you know that I have the phrase, "In God we trust, everyone else bring records." You've got to have a record to show you did what you said you were going to do, because no matter how convincing you are, you didn't do it if you don't have a record to show that you did it. Monitoring your supplier. Divide the suppliers by the area of responsibility. This is what I see. These bullets here are what, in my experience, my 300 years, remember, is from, what I've seen some of the best practices. And really divide the suppliers by the area of responsibility. So maintenance is responsible for their suppliers. Quality is responsible for their suppliers, and so forth. Each responsible manager should review those suppliers at a predetermined time frame. Recommend annually. That's usually pretty good for suppliers, depending on the criticalness of the item being supplied, and also if there are any issues going on that may need further evaluation and monitoring. Review must include any issues, nonconformances with the supplier during that time frame. Results must be recorded and reported to top management during management review meeting or other top management type meetings. Of course, if you have a formalized management system, then you have your management review meeting, and you can review the suppliers, the outcome of the review of the suppliers. You don't have to talk about it in detail, but explain, I reviewed our 10 suppliers for these items and no issues, or I've reviewed 10 and one of them has an issue, and here's what we're doing with them. A company with a large number of suppliers could split the suppliers into different quarters for review, such that all suppliers are reviewed annually. So what really that good example of that would be first quarter, the suppliers that quality is responsible for will review those and report to management review. Second quarter, the maintenance suppliers. And that splits it up so you don't end up with a management type meeting where you're talking about 100 different things with suppliers, but you split it up over time. An example before I move on, dividing up the responsibilities. I did an audit many years ago, and in doing the audit, in the HR, we were talking about the HR was responsible for the temporary services. They used a lot of temporaries. Out in the plant, when we were doing the audits, they were having some meetings with the temporaries, and my guide was telling me that they'd had some issues with training and with being dependable and stuff like that. So they were working with the temporary agency to fix the issue and to address the issue and improve on it. Well, that was fine, but in their documentation, they assigned the evaluation of suppliers to the purchasing agent. So when I was in discussing this with the purchasing agent, I asked to see his review of the temporary agency. So he pulled out a form, and on the form he had several questions, and the conclusion was everything's great. Well, when I told him they were having issues and HR was addressing them, he said, "Oh, I hadn't heard about that." So really, the evaluation of that supplier, the temporary services, should have been documented and under the control of the HR person who was actually handling it. But the system was not defined in a way that caught that. So just a heads up on that, and it's usually much cleaner and doesn't overburden a large or even a small system when you put the responsibility on those using the suppliers. So another question that comes up quite a bit. What if the supplier is required by the customer? Your company is still responsible to produce a safe product that meets specs, that meets all the requirements. Requirements for identifying and ensuring ingredients and materials meet specifications related to food safety and quality must be defined and confirmed compliant. And this could be done with ways like on receiving, make sure the temperature is what it's supposed to be on receiving. Make sure, like for instance, if it's a frozen product, they might have one of the temperature evaluation little stickers or something on each pallet, and it would be your responsibility to review it to make sure that in transit the product had definitely been kept at the required temperatures, frozen or whatever. Visual inspections of the seals on the trucks. There's many different things depending on the item and your program that you can do on the receiving end of the item. Requirements must be defined such that any non-conforming situation is addressed in a timely manner, such as rejecting the product, put it on hold, transports are rejected, etc., based on the potential risk. Also, process must ensure that the source of the item, customer buyer, for example, is notified of the situation. Overall, the process must include regularly providing a performance report to those responsible for sourcing the item. So let's say you're a large company and you have a transportation division in a corporate office somewhere else, and you're using and choosing your supplier for transporting your shipments, finished product shipment, based on that list. Well, what if they come in? What if they come in with dirty trucks? What do? I'm told we send them away. And then what happens? Well, they clean them and come back. Okay, but is that reported to anybody? What about the records where you evaluate your suppliers for holes or damages? If we don't like the supplier, if something's wrong with that transport, we don't load. We reject it. Well, where does that information go? Does it get funneled back up to the person in corporate that's responsible for monitoring? Because it may even be something that's just whoever's supplying in your area. You might be have several sites across the country, so your supplier of transportation is coming from a different main center, and maybe it's just in your area there's problems. But you just can't. You've got to have a means to report it up. Many times there are means to report if ingredients are rejected or problems are ingredients or packaging, but just as many times the service suppliers are forgotten about. We're told we have to use this pest control company, but they never come on time, they don't do a good job, and things aren't right. But we don't have any choice because corporate says we have to do that. It's your responsibility. If you have a recall or something goes wrong and it's traced back to poor pest control, guess what happens then? So you can't have a fear factor. Making your customer mad cannot influence, or making the supplier mad. You've got to report up. I mean, you have a large company that's telling you to use these people, but if the people they're telling you to use are causing problems, then or are providing nonconformances, or you don't feel comfortable with them, you've got to have a means to address that. So, do we treat all suppliers equally? Does every supplier have to be audited? We hear that all the time. Oh, now we're going to have a management system. We got to go audit all the suppliers. Not necessarily. This is an internal question based on criticalness of the product being supplied, and also on the internal resources. You can require third-party audits. You can require a supplier to be approved to a GFSI-approved food safety standard or an ISO standard or whatever. But if you do that, you have to make sure that you review it carefully, and you make sure that that they are their documentation is on the up and up. It's recommended that the food safety HACCP team evaluate the products being supplied related to risk and use this basis to decide what is needed to ensure its safety and continued compliance to defined parameters. So in today's world, more and more organizations are accepting compliance with third-party audit, such as an approved GFSA food safety scheme. But again, you've got to check it out, because there are some companies that are better than other companies for doing these third-party audits. You want to see the report. You want to see any corrective actions. When was the report done? How was it done? and just do some homework. Sometimes in the old days, I used to tell people, it was interesting because they would send out a checklist and they would say, are you ISO 9001 approved? And they'd get a checklist back saying yes, but with nothing else. You know, there are some great registrars out there that are very competent and do a great job. There's others that are really just, okay. So you need to know that. It's kind of like getting a master's. Do you want to go to Harvard for your master's, or do you want to order it from the magazine on the airplane? And I'm not putting down the registrars. There are some great registrars out there, but you need to know that, and you need to find out who is doing their audits, who has approved them, and where do they stand if you're going to hang a hat on that. I did do an audit one time years ago where it was an ISO 9001 audit, but it was a food company, and when I was doing customer service department, I actually saw a checklist that had been submitted and filled out by their customer service office, and it said, do you have a HACCP program? And it was checked off yes. And it was 9001. It wasn't in a company that was required by law to have a HACCP program. So, we never really talked about HACCP, but I had never seen a HACCP program in all the years I had been auditing them. So I asked the quality manager, and I said, so do you have a HACCP program? He said, no, why? And so when they called up the customer service guy who had checked the box on the evaluation to their customer, he said, well, I called down there and someone said you had one, so I just said yes. So we got to make sure it's credible. It's not, these mistakes aren't really always done on purpose, but probably the majority of the time not. But, it's your product that's on the line, so you need to do your homework. One company did do some audits, does do quite a few audits, a very large company with a lot of critical suppliers. They need a new supplier of an ingredient, went out there and audited the company, found that they were not comfortable with their programs in place. The auditor came back and told them there's no way we want to use them as a supplier. 3 months later, that supplier had a major, major recall, and all their customers were calling up, do you use them? Do you use them? And they said, nope, we don't use them. So it worked. So remember, understand what is required. Review the approval certificates, audit reports, and organization's corrective actions. Be sure results reflect a credible organization based on credible criteria. But again, remember, it's based on the criticalness of your supplies. If you're ordering from a catalog, say a food-grade unloading hose, you don't have to really go audit them. You just have to make sure that you know what you need and what the criteria is. If you're ordering a thermometer that must be traceable to NIST, then you look at the criteria and order it and check it when it comes in with the proper paperwork. So don't make this monumental, but make sure you're doing what you need to do where you need to do it. Measuring and ensuring the effectiveness of any PRP is a constant challenge for any organization. Based on my experience and observed success and best practices, I recommend that the Food Safety HACCP team maintain a matrix that is used to track and record supplier approval and monitoring. Matrix could be, hand done. We were asked on the last session that are there any software programs out there that do an absolute, like a supplier performance matrix? Not familiar with the TraceGains includes that. I know they trace with the ingredients, but you can do and Gary can touch on that, but you can do a really nice matrix through, I like to use Word. A lot of people use Excel. Some people master Access, but that's really involved. But, you want to make it simple. You want to make it user-friendly. And I really like doing it in Word, where I just make a table with columns, and I track it through my columns. The columns would include something like name of supplier, product or service provider. Remember, you're not just approving the supplier. You're approving the supplier for the service or product they're giving you. For instance, if you're approving a chemical supplier, some of the large chemical suppliers, they have thousands of chemicals, and these chemicals are developed and confirmed, validated for specific products. For instance, the chemicals that a dairy would use would be different than a juice would use, or possibly what a meat company would use. So you're going to identify it by the service or product, not only the supplier, but what service and supplier. And sometimes it's even the source of that, because it might be a particular manufacturing site that you are going to get this from, because in historical evidence, some of the others may not have been as effective as the one that you want to use. So you want to make sure that you have that. Or if you've approved a specific site and then all of a sudden something starts coming from another site, there might be issues that you haven't looked at. Have a brief description of the risk assessment conclusion. So you're going to evaluate the supply and the risk and what you're looking at. A description of how the supplier is assessed. What are we going to look at? Monitoring the requirements, responsibility for performing monitoring, the outcome, frequency of this monitoring, and when it was last done and when the date was due. This becomes an excellent record of performance and, when necessary, required actions to achieve compliance. So I have a sample in my new book, Food Safety Management Programs, which you can look at if you have access to it. But really, it's just common sense. Make what you want to look at, and how do you want to look at it. Sometimes the item is also ranked through this risk assessment conclusion. Is ranked for is it a high risk item or is it a medium risk item? The risk assessment conclusion includes the potential risk to the final product and the ability to meet the quality and food safety expectations, requirements, and specs. So, and you might say examples how assessed would include third-party audit, company audit, GFSA-approved scheme, etc. So you can think outside the box. Make it work for your organization and your particular food sector. Common non-conformances that we find: service suppliers are not identified. I already mentioned that. Ingredients, packaging suppliers are provided by corporate, so we don't have to do anything. I remember doing an audit a couple years back where the site, when one of the questions says, "Do you have an approved supplier program?" the answer was NA. The result of that wasn't so positive. Not applicable. Of course, it's applicable. Issues with corporate required suppliers are not addressed because the site feels they can't do anything about it. No defined program for reporting issues. Even with defined program, records indicated that as long as a credit is received, the reason or corrective action not important. Don't be shy about issuing corrective actions to your suppliers. And don't be shy, I get into trouble a lot with this statement, with issuing corrective actions against your corporate office. If that's the root cause and if they're in control, then you need to discuss it with them and get a commitment to getting it addressed. Defined frequency for evaluating the suppliers was not supported by records to confirm compliance. The procedure said you're going to evaluate your suppliers every 6 months, but there were no records to show that they were done at the 6-month interval. Suppliers used in the distant past, for example 3 years ago and not since, are automatically approved without any recent update or evaluation. That's ludicrous. I mean, the way suppliers and companies are changing hands now and people are moving around, you need to set parameters. If we haven't used the supplier in the last 6 months or the last year, then we need to do a complete reevaluation. Remember, you're not dreaming up extra work for yourself. What you're doing is looking at ways to be proactive to protect your product. And being proactive a lot of times can really save you a lot of grief later on. More common nonconformances: list of approved suppliers included the company name and not the items the supplier was approved for. I already touched on that earlier. Statement that supplier provided product per the current specification, but the current specification was not available. If you want to have some fun, go to some of your suppliers, the suppliers, especially the ones that are controlled by corporate, where you understand that corporate is providing your raw ingredient or packaging supplier with a current spec. You probably have access to your current spec. Ask that supplier to send the most current spec. This is getting a lot better, but boy, 3 or 4 years ago, it was horrible. They would either couldn't find the spec or they couldn't have the wrong spec. Even sometimes sister facilities didn't have the right spec. And what happens sometimes here is the sales folks or the buyer will send the current spec to the company, but the supplier never filters that current spec down through its processing locations. The suppliers are approved based on financial status with no evaluation, defined requirements related to food safety and quality identified. So, for instance, they're on our approved supplier list. We can't order if they're not on our approved supplier list. Well, who manages that? Well, finance does. They check all the financial data. Well, who's checking whether they can meet your food safety and quality requirements? And what's the proof of that? Supplies noted in the storage areas were not sourced by a listed approved supplier, with no record or explanation available to explain the situation. Oh, well, this is just temporary is the answer I get. Or this is an R&D project. Well, that's still not to be an approved supplier with the proper paperwork and the proper record. Organization's traceability program does not include traceability back to the supplier. We'll hear more about this shortly, but again, traceability. What about bulk loads? What about some of the things that come in? They'll say to us, well, we give it our own lot number. But can you really trace it back to the supplier? What happens? What happens if what happens if we see a traceability issue where a supplier might call up and say, we have an issue. Can you go back and find everything that product went into? So if the supplier contacts you with a serious food safety issue and states that you state that the ingredient is already in the product on the grocer's shelf, does the program provide the information needed to absolutely identify every finished product that contains the tainted ingredients? Lives could be at stake, even if it's just a quality issue. The brand could be at stake. So are you sure the process works? Mock recalls must be performed to confirm effectiveness. An emergency is not the time to find out there are flaws with your process. It's kind of ironic because a lot of companies, they do mock recalls because they have to. Well, our customer wants us to. Our corporate office makes us. But, a mock recall should be one of your best friends. If you need to make sure, you need to run mock recalls in every possible way you can to make sure that your system works, because you do not want to wait for a real recall to find out you have a glitch somewhere. So don't treat your mock recalls as a visit to some horrible situation like going to the dentist. Well, going to the dentist isn't much fun, but if you go regularly, you're going to avoid some really not fun visits in the future. So you want to make sure your mock recall program, another prerequisite program, and all your traceability processes work in a way that you are absolutely confident that if by some unforeseen situation, because remember, food safety programs, HACCP programs, they don't guarantee food safety. They're tools that help you have a very good program in place to help prevent issues. But there's no guarantee that something isn't going to go wrong, and you need to know that you have a program in place that will help you recall the product. So covered a lot of items now through this current presentation. And let's review some of the things. Know your supplier. Know your products. It's not on here, but educate your contractors. Know the service providers. Ensure confidence through every means possible. Risk assessments. You don't have to write War and Peace in a risk assessment. I've seen risk assessments. There were software programs that made me dizzy. But a risk assessment can just be to sit down and think about what you're getting and look on and find the history of the item, and is it a high risk item, and if so, what are your confirmations from your suppliers that they're giving you a product free of hazards, and what are you doing on your end to make sure this happens, or control any hazards that you need to. Extent of the control that you have on your supplier must be managed based on the potential risk of the product being supplied. Keep in mind that a large number of recalls are caused from your supplier issues. Even the small company must communicate these messages to their suppliers. I was in a small company not too long ago, and I was in the warehouse, and they had all kinds of busted up pallets. Well, the wood was everywhere. It's on the floor. That could be an issue. It's absolutely an issue. And they felt like, well, it comes from our supplier. What are we going to do? What they do is they tell the supplier of pallets they're not going to take busted pallets. They're not going to take them. There are other suppliers out there they can go and talk to. But because they're small, they think, well, this is what we get. This is what we have to deal with. Unfortunately, many small companies are taking the larger company rejects and don't even know it. It happens a lot. It may not be a food safety issue. It could be a quality issue. But it happens, so you need to protect yourself. It's usually the companies, the larger companies, or the companies that let their suppliers know that they have a sophisticated program that's going to that they're checking the supplies. They have to meet their specs, and so forth. Those people, if you have a supplier that's trying to do something underhanded, like send you something that someone else rejected, then they're not going to do that to somebody that they know that has a sophisticated program. the melamine issue. That goes to people that didn't, even though you had to look for it to find it. The companies that had very sophisticated supplies, they kind of lucked out and didn't get someone trying to sneak that in on them. I know for a fact rejected loads of aflatoxin have gone to other companies that, they've diluted it and sent it to other companies that didn't check for it. So protect yourself, protect your company, protect your consumers, and do everything you can to be responsible, not to produce a product that has hazards. Feel confident that you're not. Remember to maintain objective evidence of compliance. Have records that are legible, records that are compliant, signatures that you can read, or initials that you can trace back to training, so you know that the people doing this have been educated to understand what is necessary. Prerequisite programs are the foundation of effective HACCP program. You can never say that enough. Never take your suppliers for granted. Never assume food safety. And remember, everyone is responsible for food safety. I have interviewed people. One gentleman I interviewed with loaded trucks of finished product, and the finished product was empty bottles going to be filled with soda and water. Asked him what his responsibility was, and he said, "Oh, absolutely." He said, "I make sure that these trucks are clean. I make sure that everything goes on that truck looks good. The pallets aren't broken. The shrink wrap isn't broken. Things like that." So they double check. They double check and make sure he didn't pull the pallet from someplace that might have evidence of pest control. It's everyone's responsibility, and it's the company's responsibility to educate all of their associates to understand that. There's a really neat ASQ video. It's called Cost of Poor Quality. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you do a search of Cost of Poor Quality video. It isn't directly about food safety, but it's about what goes wrong. It has 3 very impactful scenarios of where shortcuts were taken or time was not spent to be proactive, and what the results were of this. A quotation from the end of that video states that quality and food safety is like our health. We tend to take it for granted until it fails. That video is really neat, and I would recommend it to every manager, every top manager, to show it at least at your top management meetings. So that said, I think it's time to turn it over to Gary. I hope I didn't run over, Gary.
No, great discussion, Debbie. Thanks for all your great comments. We'll just take a couple of minutes to tie in a couple of the themes that Debbie talked about in terms of automating through software, such as TraceGains, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I see we've already got a lot of great questions teed up, so we're going to enjoy answering those. So briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with TraceGains, what TraceGains does is automate many of the things that Debbie's been talking about, which are challenges for many food companies in terms of their suppliers. So let's get specific. First of all, TraceGains automates the new supplier approval process, which for many food companies, food and beverage companies, is an arduous task of reaching out to suppliers, getting them to fill out questionnaires, getting them to submit all of the documents that are required, whether it's allergen or kosher or third-party audits, so on and so forth. So TraceGains helps food and beverage companies automate the collection of all those documents from their suppliers. Debbie also talked about what could happen when suppliers are not familiar with your specifications or the very latest version of your specifications. So TraceGains automates spec management and communication of the very latest version of your specifications to your suppliers, ensuring that they have that information. Then TraceGains continuously monitors suppliers and alerts you anytime there's a problem. Now the problem could be that a document such as a third-party audit has expired, so TraceGains will alert you and instantly reach out to the supplier. And a lot of TraceGains users report they're very pleased that they don't even have to nag their suppliers anymore. TraceGains has already had that automated dialogue behind the scenes on their behalf with the suppliers. Then you get into the lot-by-lot conformance, and Debbie talked about many of these issues. First of all, TraceGains automates the process of reviewing all of the certificates of analysis that come in. And just in case there is a nonconformance on the certificate of analysis against your specifications, for example, TraceGains will pick that up. TraceGains also automates issues that can show up on the receiving dock. It may be that seals were improperly placed on the trailer or container. It may be there's damage. It may be there's evidence of pests. TraceGains allows you to report on that and keep a scorecard of that on all your suppliers. Then many food companies do sample testing, either in-house or through a third-party lab, so we allow people to automate that and get alerts on any problems there. And then lastly, sometimes problems with suppliers and the materials they provide don't show up till it gets all the way to the plant floor, and you open a container and you find fragments or pests or whatever the problem may be. So TraceGains picks up on that and automates that as well. At the end of the process, you may need to do a traceback to a supplier lot. And so TraceGains has all this information, allows you to instantly trace back on all the lots that have come in for a particular ingredient, who were all the suppliers, what were your facilities that they were shipped to, and all the history that we were talking about in terms of COAs and receiving and test results and all of that comes along with that traceback. And then very last topic that we'll talk about is supplier scorecarding and a supplier matrix. TraceGains also automates that and allows you to profile all your suppliers and scorecard them on all of this data, including even having a global risk profile where TraceGains can tell you all your ingredients that come from all over the globe, since so many ingredients are imported now, and where your greatest risk is at, and comes up with an automatic scorecarding system to alert you to that. So how do we do this? How do we do all this? Well, really, here's the key. The key is many companies today in the food and beverage industry, you get all these documents in, but then you file them away. Now, it may not look as bad as this. It may not be a paper file cabinet. It may be an electronic file cabinet, such as SharePoint or some sort of shared drive. But the issue is you're still filing them away. You're not putting them into a centralized database that is analyzable, searchable, reportable, and so on and so forth. So the key with TraceGains is to take all of these documents and extract all the critical data off of these documents, get it into a centralized database, and that gives you then the 24/7 firewall, alerting you to any non-compliances. It allows you to do all the scorecarding, supplier matrix, global risk ingredient profile, and gives you instant alerts to any non-conformances that come up. And lastly, one advantage to taking all this information and putting it into a centralized database is not only does it allow you to address all these supplier and HACCP prerequisite issues that Debbie's talked about, it allows you to do some other things as well. It's very helpful in audits, either internal audits that you're doing or when your customers are coming to audit you, or when you're auditing your suppliers, if you do some of that. Along with the recognized GFSI schema, it helps have all this information so you can do a desk audit, you can do a preparation audit, have all the information available. Obviously that overlaps into FSMA, and I know we've already gotten at least one question on FSMA that we'll answer here shortly. And it also helps with labeling, because a lot of companies in the food and beverage industry tell us that they have a labeling system, but at the end of the day, that system is dependent on all these different documents you collect from your suppliers and all the per 100 gram nutritional information. So by extracting that off the documents coming in from the suppliers, putting that into a database, we're able to automate many of the labeling procedures as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our moderator, Mark, for Q&A.
Thank you, Debbie and Gary, and thank you to the audience. We'll have time to take questions. We have received several already. You can type them into the chat dialog box, and we'll get them addressed. Debbie, the first one is for you. I think, Gary, you might have a thought on this one as well. Are there FDA regulations that require packaging materials manufacturers to adhere to food safety? For example, bulk containers like drums that are used to hold food products. These manufacturers claim they're industrial manufacturers, but they're also suppliers of containers to food processors.
Well, when FSMA comes out, it's going to look at any manufacturer and anything that comes into, it's a large possibility it's going to look for anything that has direct any kind of direct contact with a food product. So that could be in our future. Of course, FSMA, we don't know exactly what the final law is going to look at like yet. But typically it's the suppliers, it's your customers that are requiring direct or indirect contact to, for a company to at least have a hazard analysis. Chances are you're not going to have a critical control point, and that's why FSMA's, changing even look instead of HACCP, it's looking at HARPC, HARPC, because it's hazard analysis risk preventive controls. So with HACCP, hazard analysis critical control point, a lot of focus is, well, we don't have a CCP, we don't need to do anything, which is really not the truth, and not really the way it should be, and not the way anybody should approach it, because everyone should do a hazard analysis and make sure they have effective prerequisite programs. If they don't, then they're not in control of their process. But to answer your question, it's really right now up to the individual organizations to look at their suppliers and anything that could come in contact, because there is a responsibility in the law that you do produce a safe product. So if there's a hazard that could come from a direct or indirect contact with a packaging material, like a glass bottle that could have pieces of glass, then you're responsible to make sure you don't have glass in your product, even if the bottle's coming from somebody else. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and this is Gary. I'll just chime in as well to add to what Debbie talked about. It's interesting. We've heard this question come up before, and it was interesting the way it was phrased, because technically the manufacturers of the packaging material, technically they are exempt from FSMA, because in the definition of food and beverage in FSMA, it excludes packaging material from the definition of food. So technically those guys are off the hook. But here's where the loophole comes in. In Section 103 of FSMA, that's all about preventative controls. And so what that does is put the onus back on the food manufacturer and brand owner to check this stuff. So technically your supplier's off the hook on this, but you are not. So if there's a problem like Debbie talked about with glass, that is your responsibility under Section 103 of FSMA. And the other section of FSMA where this comes into play is Section 301, which is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which again, if they're a packaging supplier and you're importing packaging materials from overseas, again, technically they're off the hook, but you are not. You're responsible from a preventative control standpoint. So you really are responsible for it, and it's all the more reason to be on top of all these issues we've been talking about with suppliers, including food contact packaging material.
Next question. Debbie, based on your experience, what are good methods or indicators in measuring the effectiveness of a PRP?
Well, it's going to depend on the prerequisite program, and that sounds like a cop-out, but for example, how do you measure the effectiveness? For instance, how do you measure the effectiveness of a pest control program? People tell me, how do you know I'll ask, how do you know its effectiveness? They say, we use an outside source. So that in itself is not evidence of effectiveness. You might have an outside source, but how do you manage them as a supplier? How do you communicate the requirements? I mean, you may review what they say they'll do and accept that as your requirement, but how do you ensure that they're effective? I mean, do you walk around with them? Do you actually put little cards or like a rubber mouse or something in a unit and tell them to return it to you and monitor how long that takes? How do you know it's effective? I mean, obviously, if you don't see any debris and stuff from rats or any insects flying around, you could say, well, they're effective, but that could be a result of your sanitation programs and stuff. So you really have to think about what you're trying to measure and what it takes. So the person that's responsible for the item should really know about how to measure the effectiveness. But then overall, from a food safety team, you'd look at different items. Like you'd say, how is the responsible person measuring effectiveness, and then you do maybe a GMP audit or through internal audits and things like that. You can monitor customer complaints, but that's more reactive. Don't say to an auditor, we know they're effective because no one's complaining. That's not the whole story. So it really is a case-by-case item. Like what are you using? Temporary associates. How are you going to measure the effectiveness of your temporary agency. Again, it depends on what you expect of them. Some companies expect that they come all trained to your requirement and ready to go. Other companies just are accessing an individual, and once they get on site, they do all the training. So it's a case-by-case thing, but you've really got to put your thinking cap on and ask yourself, how do I know this is working? How do I know it's effective?
And I think this
I have a whole
next
chapter
question,
on that in my book, so I mean, it's hard to answer that question in 2 minutes, but I hope that helps.
I should put your book up on the screen, but I don't have a large screenshot of it. But it's on Debbie's website as well, at newslow.com.
Yeah, and email me. We actually have I'm not trying to sell the book, but email me, and I actually have a discount and free shipping from the I just got from the publisher, so we're sharing that with our clients. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to sell the book for you. So, next question I think is for the both of you. You probably have seen several examples here. What is the best supplier program you have seen when using co-manufacturers?
So a co-manufacturer would be somebody that you hired to manufacture up either manufacture your whole product or a part of it. Correct? That's what I would think we're talking about. Best supplier program. Well, you got to clearly define what you're expecting. ISO 9001 states, and this applies to every other standard on this earth, states that you have to clearly define the product ordered. So if you have a co-manufacturer, you have to clearly define the product ordered. You have to say, this is what we expect, these are the requirements you have to do, and you have to have records and evidence. Sometimes, you should visit them. You really should visit them, if they're doing that. But, at least get the records, and again, it depends on the potential risk of the item. But a lot of times, companies don't mess with the suppliers. I had a person one time tell me that we have an outside warehouse, she said, and my boss won't let me audit them. They're not even following our GMPs. And he says, well, don't worry about it. That's not our company. But they stored all their products. So what in the heck's going to happen when something, they don't have pest control, or something goes wrong, or a light bulb breaks and their product's contaminated? Their product's in jeopardy. So you have to decide what exactly you expect of that co-manufacturer, what they're doing for you, and what you expect of them, and what the proof is that they're going to live up to your expectations. And how do you know that?
Yeah, and I'll just chime in on that as well. I agree with Debbie's points. A lot of our customers who use TraceGains to automate all these different supplier documents and data, obviously some of their suppliers are co-manufacturers in certain cases. So everything we talked about a minute ago, I'm not going to repeat, but all of those different documents and gathering those can be automated for co-manufacturers just like it can be for any other suppliers. A lot of our customers would also classify co-manufacturers as a special type of supplier, and they may say, look, because you're a co-manufacturer, here is a particular document or certain types of data that I also require from you that I do not require from other suppliers. So there's a lot you can do with automation here. At the end of the day, though, you've got practical issues such as if that co-manufacturer is also making product for one of your competitors, how much are they really going to let you in the door, and how much of their inside information are they going to share? So a lot can be automated, but at the end of the day, you've probably got to work out an agreement with your co-manufacturers that you both can live with on a practical basis.
The next question, Debbie, is about an approved supplier list. Should each site have a copy of the corporate approved supplier list? Because the usual answer that is given is corporate manages the ASL. And if I were to rephrase that question a little, Debbie, should each site have its own approved supplier list as opposed to just a copy of the corporate ASL?
Well, I don't know that having a list from corporate is going to be helpful. It's because usually with the corporate approved supplier list, that's where when they go to order their items, they release it to a PO or something. We could say, they should have access to it. How do you know they're on the approved list, and on what basis are they approved? And then they get that information from corporate. A lot of times the corporate office is even audited based on their role in managing the purchasing group. But what they do need is, how do they know that when they get that item in, it's hazard-free? How do they know it's meeting, where are the requirements for that item, related to quality and food safety defined, and how do they know, what is their assurance when it's received that it's meeting those requirements? So that's where you'd say, well, we only order, or we can only, release against POs that's on the approved supplier list. And then you ask the site, well, how do you know, where is it defined what's related to quality and food safety, and how do you know that they're meeting that requirement?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. On a practical basis, we've seen, especially our larger customers, deal with this, where they've got corporate, they've got multiple plant facilities, obviously, and in those situations, what they'll often do is set up the system to list approved suppliers, not just at the corporate level, but based on the plants they are approved to supply for. And they may even go to the level of having just documents in the database that are specific to just certain items and certain plants, and they can segregate that out. So the people at corporate who may be charged with collecting things like insurance documents and so on and so forth, they're happy. They can use the system to monitor that, get their alerts, follow up with suppliers, etc. The people at the plant level can focus on the data that's more specific to them, which might be could be an allergen statement or kosher or something like that.
We are getting... just add one more thing, if I could. By maintaining your own, if your corporate has a massive list that you're ordering from and you have them at your own site, all that's doing is reinventing the wheel. So we don't want to do that. We want to take advantage of what we have, but make sure that you it's kind of like a relay race. They have that portion of it, but then when you take on responsibility, how do you know that it's safe and it meets the spec?
We're getting a couple of questions, very technical questions about trace gains from the audience, and I won't ask them here because it's not the topic of the webinar, and I think most people won't be interested about the answers. But we will reach out personally and individually to those people who have those questions. The next question, Debbie, could you address the role of HACCP for kosher and halal foods and ingredients?
Well, I don't. It still has to be safe products. So kosher and how they are evaluating the product based on, their religious requirements, and that's good. But whoever manufactures that product, if you're getting an ingredient in that's kosher approved, that doesn't take away from the responsibility that it still has to be a safe product without any hazards, physical, chemical, or pathogens. So, it's great. They have their own set of criteria that are required to be kosher, or how, like certain ways to handle the product and certain products and everything, but it still does not resolve, the safety of the product. And that's so when you look, that may identify an ingredient. For instance, you have maybe kosher, a kosher sauce, kosher pickles or something that's going to go into your product, and you have the kosher seal from the ingredient supplier that says it's kosher approved, which is great because you need that for your customer, but you still need everything else that could be a hazard with that product addressed. So that's really, kind of out, outside of the, I don't know that it's outside the realm of HACCP. It identifies an ingredient and the requirements of the ingredients. Now, if you are on site and you're having these approvals made at your site, it's addition to your food safety program because it's a different criteria that they're looking at. I think that answers the question.
Next question, what effective methods have you seen when managing documentation from brokers, and what does FSMA say about brokers from an approval standpoint?
Well, I don't know that FSMA addresses the brokers, but the brokers now are getting into having to make sure that they get the criteria from, that's where a lot of issues happen, especially, say, like in the juice market and stuff like that, where you're making, maybe an ingredient, like maybe a fruit punch or something, and you're getting different products, different concentrates from different from the broker, but the broker's getting it from different locations all over the world, and it's coming now to where the broker's going to is going to have all all their ducks in a row with documentation and records to show that their source of ingredients or products or whatever they're sourcing has met all the requirements for a safe product. And that's going to be carried over with the way FSMA addresses imports, and what's required of the imports that's going to fall into the FSMA reg. So brokers are going to have to know this, and they're going to have the records, because when they ship that ingredient to their customer, which could be your organization, it's going to have to come with all of the records and documentation showing that it complies.
Yeah. And I'll just second that. It doesn't matter where you got the product from. If you need the documents and the data, you need the documents and the data. I won't get into the details, but TraceGains has some help with automation here, where it does segregate the difference between a normal supplier and how that supplier sends in documents versus broker-type suppliers, just to make life a little easier for brokers and to encourage them to be more quick and more compliant.
And here's the last question that's come up, and it's a great question, Debbie. We're making a finished product for a customer and also using their ingredients to manufacture with. Should we put these ingredients and the customer through our approved supplier program?
Well, it depends on the ingredient and it depends on what the customer is doing. A lot of large companies with their customers, they pre-approve, or they're sending you, say, a base, or they're saying you buy this from this customer, and they've gone through the approval. So at the very minimum, you need to understand what that customer is doing, how that customer knows that when you use that ingredient that they're supplying you, that it's safe. And then still you have the onus at your site to make sure it meets the designated requirements, make sure it inspected. It might be a testing thing, for instance, if it has to be at a certain moisture level. You might check the moisture level, because above the level, a level will make the product more susceptible to growth. That could be something that the organization, the receiving organization does. Inspection. I've seen this firsthand, where you might open a drum of concentrate or a product that you're getting from your customer, and you open it up, and it's all moldy. I mean, the operator says, well, it came from the customer, they must want us to use it. That's not the way it is. We've got to make sure that it's what it's supposed to be, and it's safe, it's a critical supply, then you have to have proof of it. And then on top of that, you need to have a way to communicate back to them if there's any issues, to make sure that it's not an ongoing thing. Because if you have a contract to make so many products and ship on a certain day, and the stuff you're getting from the customer is telling you to use is not something you're going to use and put your name on it, then guess what? You can't make your order. So you have to deal with this. You have to have good relationships, and you have to think outside the box and be proactive.
Great.
Don't
Thank
worry
you, Debbie.
about making the customer mad either. I mean, don't make whoever you're reporting back to. You've got to protect the brand and the finished product.